And on behalf of the ML Sondi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs and the ML Sondi Trust, I welcome you to the second webinar on the theme, Geopolitics along the Indo-Tibetan border. I have a special welcome for Ambassador Man Singh, former Foreign Secretary of India, who will be chairing the webinar. I also welcome the main speakers, former General Lamba, former Vice Chief of the Indian Army and currently President of Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. I welcome Ambassador Chenoy, former envoy to Japan and Mexico and currently Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. And finally, I welcome Dr. Ashley Tellis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The welcome to Dr. Tellis is a bit special. He was the first recipient of the ML Sondi Prize for International Politics in 2007. I will now ask Mrs. Madhuri Sondi, trustee of the ML Sondi Trust, to give her opening remarks. Sondi, you can unmute your speaker and please speak. Your speaker is muted. Please unmute your speaker. Your speaker is muted.
Oh, let's see.
Yeah, now you're on.
Now it's okay. Yeah, right. Thanks. So on behalf of the ML Sondi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs and the Professor ML Sondi Trust, I join Vivekanand in welcoming our chairman, ex-Foreign Secretary Lalit Man Singh, our distinguished panelists, Professor Ashley Tellis, General Arvind Lamba, and retired Ambassador Sujan Chenoy, and our distinguished audience to today's webinar, the second in a series concerning geopolitics along the Indo-Tibetan border. We remember Professor Sondi as a Rhodes Scholar, a UPSC topper, diplomat, public activist, parliamentarian, academic, who taught in the Indian School of International Studies, JNU, and in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and served as chairman of the Indian Council for Social Science Research. He had resigned from the Foreign Service after becoming increasingly critical of what he saw as the equivocations of non-alignment between totalitarian and democratic states. These were starkly exposed by the activities of China's PLA against the Tibetan populace in the 50s, which compelled the Dalai Lama to flee to India in 1959. And this was followed in 1962 by China's push into India at Aksai Chin along the Indo-Tibetan border. Thus, Professor Sondi felt the need to reconceptualize India's declared foreign policy goals and modus operandi, and to rethink policies on specific areas bordering or impacting India's territory and interests. He evolved a principle of non-appeasement to correct the vulnerabilities of non-alignment as practiced. But along with this almost defiant formulation, he was also deeply interested in conflict management within societies and between nations. And he was to pioneer the introduction of peace studies in Indian academia. Peace being, of course, a different enterprise from pacification. Coming to his concerns about the geopolitical threat from China and the possibilities of an architectured response from concerned countries, I would like to share with you 3 vignettes which illustrate his farsightedness. In 1965, in the course of a dialogue with German political scientist Klaus Bernhardt, Professor Sondi had observed, I quote, "It is India's political strength and willpower, along with that of countries like Japan, that will largely determine the possibilities of controlling the recklessness of Chinese leaders and ensuring peace in Asia and the world." This was 1965, so he mentioned just Japan, but no doubt he would add others. Number 2, again in the mid-90s, when Rakesh Ahuja served as Australian Deputy High Commissioner in Delhi, Professor Sondi, in anticipation of a naval threat from China, raised with him the possibility of maritime collaboration between India and Australia. Foreign Minister Gareth Evans had apparently taken an interest, but the discussions petered out when he demitted office in 1996. And lastly, I quote the concluding paragraphs from an essay written in 2002 by Professor Sondhi and Professor Ashok Kapoor of Carleton University, entitled Indian Ocean Area, and I quote, "The new frontier and center of gravity is the Indian Ocean, which is the junction where Chinese, American, Russian, Indian, and Japanese interests, along with those of Indonesia and most Southeast Asian countries, converge, and they collide potentially between China and the rest in the military sphere in the coming decades. It is no longer necessary for India to worry about Chinese sensitivities. China is guided by its national security interests and says so openly. The aim of Indian foreign policy is not to seek good and friendly relations in quotes, as MEA annual reports ritually state. The aim of foreign policy is to seek the best possible relations which are consistent with a country's national interest. The issue of democracy, I'm continuing the quote, the issue of democracy divides China from the rest of Asia. The new theme in Asia is not America and the rest, but the reality in the area of democracy and strategic affairs is that the foreseeable future points to a theme of China and the rest in Asia now. So we see, unquote. So we see that not only was Professor Sondhi prescient in his early warnings about China, but also that some of his geostrategic ideas for achieving lasting peace in Asia are finding their resonance today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador Mansingh, can we please request you to unmute yourself?
It says only the host can unmute.
Yes, you are unmuted now.
Well, first of all, let me thank Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi. You have given us what amounts to a keynote speech for our discussions today. But let me thank both you and Mr. Vivekanand Sondhi, trustees of the ML Sondhi Trust, for creating a platform for informed discussions on issues of national and international importance. I can't think of a more befitting tribute to Professor Sondhi, who dedicated his life to discussing very passionately these very issues. And China was at the core of his interest. Well, I have a feeling that the trustees must have consulted an astrologer for fixing the date and time of these discussions. Because just a few days ago, the defense ministers of China and India met on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and discussed the situation on the border. And as we speak now, the foreign ministers of China and India are in conversation in Moscow again. 4 days ago, for the first time in 45 years, Chinese and Indian armies exchanged shots on the line of actual control. There can't be a more opportune moment for discussing China as now, because India-China relations are at perhaps their worst since 1962. Now, our choice of China as the focus of discussions is obvious. China has emerged as a rogue superpower whose actions will impact not only on India, but shape the geopolitics of this century. So we are looking forward to hearing from an impressive trio of experts. We begin with General Arvinder Lamba, a much decorated officer who served as the Vice Chief of Army Staff. He is unmatched in his deep knowledge of military affairs and for the clarity of his analysis. He's very different from the kind of generals you see on our television channels, the macho generals who point an angry finger and hurl threats of dire punishment to Pakistan and China. Well, General Lamba is different from that. General Lamba will give us an update on the India-China military balance, not about the tactical situation on the LAC, but the wider overview of the military capabilities of India and China. Without anticipating his presentation, I will request General Lamba to include, if possible, his views on two issues I consider important. One, considering that China today has the largest army, the largest navy, an arsenal of nuclear missiles that can reach any corner of the world, and its overwhelming cyber and space capability, how confident should India be about defending its territorial integrity and sovereignty in case there is a conflict along the Indo-Tibet border? And the second point is, does India have what Admiral Arun Prakash recently described as a China-specific countervailing strategy to safeguard our national interests? These are the two issues, if possible, General Lamba may include. I know this is a tall order in what is supposed to be a 10-minute presentation, but I hope that his remarks on these issues may lead to a more extended discussion on the subject in this very forum. Our second speaker is my good friend, Dr. Ashley Tellis. He's widely respected as an American analyst on geopolitical issues, but he's undoubtedly the leading strategic expert in India, on India in the United States. Ashley worked closely with Ambassador Bob Blackwell in navigating the US nuclear deal and pushing the Indo-US strategic partnership from the American side. I look forward to his comments on US-China rivalry and its impact on the post-COVID geopolitical scene. There are, however, three specific issues of concern from India, and I would request Ashley, if possible, to blend this into his analysis. Number one, about the shape of the post-COVID world. There are many interesting commentaries coming up on the subject, but amongst the latest is a book by our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. Dr. Jaishankar speculates that there will be more multipolarity and less multilateralism in the world. Less multilateralism and more multipolarity. Ashley, I want you to share your view on this, to comment on the global multilateral structure and whether this structure, including the UN, the WTO, the WHO, this structure has broken down beyond repair, and that the future will see a proliferation of opportunistic alliances, of states, and there is an ugly term that is going to describe these states, the frenemies, who are both friends and enemies and neither friends nor enemies. A second issue is, you have described the US as a true hegemon. To the world, however, America looks like a battered and exhausted superpower in retreat. Do you believe that America can be rejuvenated enough to face what Nick Burns calls the cosmic struggle against China? Interestingly, Dr. Jaishankar also remarks that in the past 2 decades, China has been winning without fighting, and the US has been fighting without winning. So I want you to tell us if you believe that the United States will be able to reverse this so that we will see China fighting and US winning. So your thoughts on that. And following from the above, is there a possibility of war between the United States and China. It's a question that concerns the entire world. Ashley's former colleague, Ambassador Blackwell, just a few days ago, circulated his 9 core beliefs on China. And interestingly, these 9 core beliefs included his prediction that there will be a permanent confrontation between China and the United States, and there is a distinct possibility of war. And finally, the question that is in everyone's mind, what will the US presidential elections bring for India? I am frankly not interested in whether Trump or Biden is the winner. From my experience, it makes no difference for India if the president is Democratic or Republican. But the real issue is, after the dust settles down in Washington in January 2021, what direction will Indo-US relations take in the next few decades? In the years of George W. Bush, Ashley, you had argued with great conviction that the US should not extract a quid pro quo from India, that India joining the US in a strategic partnership was the reward itself. Of late, I have heard you state that India's only choice now is to declare an alliance with the US or face irrelevance. I'm a little intrigued, or maybe I have misunderstood you and would like to have your clarification. And by the way, let me add that Dr. Jaishankar has recently publicly stated that India, and I quote him, will never be a part of any alliances. Our final speaker will be Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, a dear friend and a colleague from the Foreign Service. He is, to my mind, the leading expert on China. But looking at his career profile, I think it deserves to be Mr. Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific region has been his oyster. I expect that Ambassador Chinoy's presentation will be a continuation of the narrative of Dr. Tellis, with a shift of focus from the global to the regional. Ambassador Chinoy will enlighten us on the Quad, this mysterious, secretive, and elusive organization that has been surfacing and disappearing in the last 2 decades or so. It was Prime Minister Abe of Japan who had first proposed not just the concept of the Indo-Pacific, but the idea of a coalition of maritime democracies. The US has taken this to a new level with the announcement recently by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo of an alliance of democracies to face the challenge of China. The Quad, in my view, seems to be an unlikely candidate to lead this epic battle. It is facing an uncertain future at the moment. The US will go in for elections within 2 months. Japan will soon face a leadership vacuum when Prime Minister Abe steps down. Australia has gone through bouts of panic before and seems to be on the verge of another one. And India has been the most reluctant amongst the partners to see the Quad as a security platform. Is the Quad then the best multilateral shield for India against China, or are there other options? Well, I'm raising a lot of questions, but I'm expecting our experts to provide us with the answers. So without much ado, General Lamba, you're on the floor. General Lamba.
Can we unmute General Lamba, please? Go ahead, General Lamba. No.
General Lamba, you have to unmute yourself. I have given you the permission. Please unmute yourself.
Unmute, unmute.
Yeah, is that fine?
Yes.
Sir, good evening, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to share my views on an important issue that we're discussing today. It's a pleasure to be amongst this elite group of panelists and on discussing and sharing views on the probably most intense moments of not the year or the time, but of the decade at least, when we are seeing an evolution in the dynamics of international, national, and regional security. I have, like Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, the chair, said, that I have a very daunting challenge to cover the military balance in 10 minutes between two giants whose not only their intrinsic strengths are phenomenal, but the extrinsic strengths of particularly India as they have evolved has been phenomenal. But I'll get it down and see how I can cover this in a quick span of about 9 minutes left. Well, military balance is an essential assessment, not only annual, but going on to evaluate the situations of hostilities and standoffs between nations. For India and China, I think this is one of the most serious moments that really can take us to an escalation ladder, which may be reversible by good diplomacy and sensible thinking, or may go out of control into a localized conflict, or perhaps, hopefully, not a war. Three things are important in the military balance. I must recount as it relates to us as anywhere else, but some of these issues are more relevant to us. First is our national security strategy and the military strategy, which guides the entire capability of a system to come across as far as military balance is concerned. The force ratios, which come out of the military numbers, and there are charts available on the net about the Indian Air Force, the Indian Navy vis-a-vis the PLA Navy, and the Chinese Air Force, the PLAAF, and the Indian Air Force. And from that, we evolve what we call the combat ratios. But combat ratios is a very nebulous term because when you think about it from a military perspective, the cross-term effects of one from geography to the most advanced weapon system are so intricate that anybody talking about force ratios as distinctly as we could say in the past, maybe 1.2 to 1 or 1.6 to 1 were possible about 15 to 20 years back when I was in the strategic analysis, the directorate of the army. Third is the advanced weapon systems that have come about in both the armies, particularly today, the hyper missiles, the hypersonic weapons. I think they really take every balance on a different ledge or an edge. And I think they can weigh off completely in favor to an extent, at least in a particular sector of hostilities to a large degree. Finally, two, technological advancements and state of modernization and informationalization. These have been terms that was initially coined by the advanced armies of the world. China itself has taken them as one of its prime goals. And that's why we have skewed ourselves into reading much more about the Chinese army in these contexts than compare them with the other armies. It's right. Having considered these aspects, I think we could establish that today to devolve a force ratio goes beyond the nebulous terms. It's right to almost virtually see any adversary as almost or nearly equal. And why I say that is deterrence is the balancing factor. You will go on to asymmetric deterrence. You will go on to deterrence of a different scale to balance out conventional warfare disparities. You may go on to the nuclear domain, and from the nuclear domain to a set of space weapon-based platforms that can alter the magnitudes of any measure. Leaving it at that, I would not really qualify, though Ambassador Mansingh, the chair, has given me a line to comment on in the end, and that is about with such a large army, a navy, and an air force, where does India stand as far as Chinese capabilities is concerned? And I'll cover that in a quick few lines in the end. The second part is about the forward deployments. When we come to the situation on the LSC, I think we need to extend the perspective, not just on the LSC, but this time on the Indian Ocean frontier as well. Well, in a way, the extent of the perspective is so huge this time, it's not a two-front war, but it's a more than two-front war. When we talked of 2.5, 10 years back, we used to include the half of internal security or the insurgencies in the north and the northeast. But today, we have a full spectrum domain of the Indian Ocean adding up to another front, which we also need to rebalance. So where we are today in deterrence. So in the forward deployments, two more aspects are important. One, today's news, as per the media, says about 50,000 troops are of the Chinese army, PLA, and about 150 fighters are in the front line along the LSC of India with India. This is a huge dynamic which is going to influence deployments on both sides and what the intents and intensity is. If one looks at the intent, a strategic perspective will indicate it's no longer transgressions or taking bits of territory. The intent is to alter the configuration of the LAC to an extent that it gives exponential advantage to China for the future. We must remember that China has had these 24 meetings with India and various mechanisms that have evolved over the last 50 years of negotiation. It's actually landed us in the situation we ought to have foreseen much earlier. So we see we are balanced. We are now faced with a situation where we have the forward deployments. And I think when I went to the intention, the most striking forward deployment is that in the Kashgar region of Tibet, where they call it a nuclear vault has been established by the Chinese. Innumerable missiles, aircrafts which carry this, silos which would have the ability to strike not just any target in India, but some of them even speak about reaching out to some targets in the US if required. And I think that point is a real game changer. The intent of bringing forward these elements into Kashgar, which is sort of equidistant from maybe, from DBO and from Aksai Chin, it's from Karakoram Pass, it's all in the region of about 350 to 550 kilometers. And I think this region, the deployment of nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles is one of the most dangerous movements, forward deployments that have been taken up by China. And third is, so where are we in the situation and what do we do from here? We have two aspects. One, are we ready for a confrontation which is possible? I think before that, one important aspect in the strategic outlook and disposition of India, I think is worth recounting. India always survived on a strategy of deterrence by denial, holding positions strongly, deploying adequate troops, and hoping that we can save our sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think India has shown, maybe after Doklam, and in a complete adoption of this strategy today, it has displayed the kind of forward deployment of the Air Force, exploitation of the strategic recce and surveillance capabilities available with the P-8s and with the naval resources, bringing in the capabilities that have emerged out of the Indo-US cooperation, which are enormous as far as giving a strategic overview of the developments in the area, tactically, operationally, and strategically, giving a solid advantage. As far as the Air Force is concerned, we have seen one of the finest forward movements by the Indian Air Force by a multitude of aircraft with capability that can very well equal, if not surpass, the capability of the PLAFF. The challenges of the PLAF, the Chinese Air Force, cannot be underplayed. They have high altitudes to operate from. They have limited loads, and I think most important is the kind of airfields that they have built up in Tibet are not mutually supporting. That means if one aircraft or a fighter were to take off, it will either spend a lot of its fuel and its access to deck the targets in depth, and if that base where it took off from was struck by the Indian Air Force, it would not be able to reach to an alternative airfield by its fuel and range capability. And I think these give the Indian Air Force an enormous advantage. Finally, a word about the Navy. Indian Navy is part of the Indo-Pacific. That should sum up what I intend to say. It's not the number of vessels, it's not the number of frigates or the destroyers that we have today or the submarines. It's the exponential gain that one gets out of putting together all our assets strategically as part of the Indo-Pacific Command, and where a host of other resources from the world that thinks that this situation requires a substantial participation is very important. So in the larger canvas, I think the Navy today tells us that the numbers of the Indian Navy do not matter. It's the collective exponential capability that's been impacting China's decision-making on the oceans. Just 2 more minutes to cover, sir. What then are India's responses? You know, we have narratives, and I was the Army Commander ARTRAC when we evolved the two-front doctrine, a narrative that has been questioned over the past seriously. And I think it is right to assume that we have come a long way to put into effect or have the built-in capability to handle a two-front war, or at least handle one front and manage the other. And that's the combination that will evolve. Second is India's stability option and posture. I think what we have shown in the last 2 months after May is a correct reflection of India's ability to create stability across its border, the entire length from Leh to the northeast across Arunachal Pradesh. Third, a word about Pakistan. What can it really do? In my personal perspective, knowing the kind of divisions they can move in and from where they have their strike course placed, just as we know as much about the plans of the threat from China as to how many divisions are there, 50,000 would not make more than 8 to 10 divisions. And the old-time high-level threat used to be about 24 to 30 divisions. I think that is a capability which needs to be reviewed in our threat. It's right to bring up 3 divisions which are mechanized, have integral armor and heavy artillery and so on.
To wind up, please.
Just 2 minutes, just a minute more, sir. And finally, what a word about the India's military option. I think very important to recall the recent call by the chief that if nothing happens, well, India has the military option. Given the force deployments, given what emerges out of these forces that are across the border, the deployments of the Indian Air Force, Navy, and the Army resources, and the strength of international community in various forums from Indo-Pacific down into the Indo-China border, we are in a posture that, one, we can defend our territorial integrity. Second, given the strength of our military, of our strike corps in the mountains and resources that have been in the mountains and high altitude for years, we can orchestrate a limited offensive, at least to countervail an immediate situation. Sir, I would answer the 2 questions you left with me, though partly answered in the first part. I'll come back to you specifically in the Q&A, if you permit me, sir.
Good, good. Well, thank you. Thank you, General Lamba. And now I request Dr. Ashley Tellis to make his presentation. Ashley?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mansingh. It's a real pleasure for me to be back here with the ML Sondhi Institute for the reasons that Vivekananda identified at the beginning. I have a very special affection for this institution. And I really, it was a privilege for me to get to know Mr. Sondhi in the last years of his life when I was at the embassy in Delhi. It's also wonderful to be able to join old friends, you, Lalit, General Lamba, and of course, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy. I think Vivekananda sort of read my mind because when he set up the topic for me to offer reflections on today, he asked me to speak about, of course, the US-China rivalry, but then proposed three alternatives: bipolarity, the prospect of a new world order, or the prospect of global conflict. The more I thought about his title, I realized that the answer is actually all three. And so I want to spend a few minutes laying out why I believe that is the case. And then I want to reflect on some implications of what I say at the conceptual level for India, including trying to address the questions that you, Ambassador Mansingh, laid out for me. So let me start with the whole question of first, is bipolarity the future of the US-China relationship? I think the short answer to that is yes. Let me start by saying that the current world order, in my view, is still substantially unipolar. And when one looks at capabilities in depth, what the Chinese call comprehensive national power, there is simply no other state in the international system that has both the breadth of capabilities and the depth of capabilities that the United States has. So when one looks at simply raw capabilities, comprehensive national power, I think the United States really stands in a league by itself. There is no assurance, however, that this world will remain in perpetuity. And in fact, I believe that we are on the cusp of an evolution towards a different kind of international order. And that's really the new world order, which is the second alternative that Vivekananda laid out in the title of this presentation. And that new world order, in my view, is really a gradual shift towards asymmetric bipolarity. It's not going to be multipolarity. And I know there are many in India who believe that multipolarity is on the anvil. I think when one looks at capabilities again, in the material sense, the capabilities of the United States, the capabilities of China, and the capabilities of the European Union are truly qualitatively different from the capabilities of every other state in the international system. Now, the problem we have, of course, is that the European Union is not a real state. And given the dynamics that are underway in Europe, it is unlikely that the dream of having a unified Europe, that is a Europe that acts as a state entity, I think seems even further away today than it was, say, 20 years ago. And so if one keeps the EU out of the equation as a very special case, I think you're really left with two countries, the United States and China, that stand by themselves. This doesn't mean that there are no other powers in the international system. Of course there are. But the character of their capabilities, the depth of their capabilities will not rival those of the United States and China. So in that sense, if you look at the world to come, I would make the argument that we are slowly evolving from a system that currently still remains unipolar, where capabilities are at issue, to a system that is slowly becoming bipolar, but asymmetrically so. And I say asymmetrically so because I want to flag one similarity and one big difference between the bipolarity of the future and the bipolarity of the Cold War. The Cold War was also a period of bipolarity, as all of us well know. And it was also asymmetric in that US power was far greater than the power of its competitor, the Soviet Union at that time. In fact, I believe Soviet power rarely rivaled even 50% of US power, and did so for just a few years, if memory serves right, in the 1970s. So even though the Soviet Union was a very powerful rival, it never really managed to equalize itself to the United States in comprehensive capabilities. I believe the same will be true for the world to come. That is, China too will not be able to equalize itself to the United States in terms of comprehensive capabilities. But Chinese power will be far greater than Russia ever was. And when one looks again at material strengths, I think it is plausible to imagine that Chinese economic power in particular could well reach between 70 and 80% of US GDP in at least the next 2 decades. And that means China will be far more consequential in terms of its capacity to produce material capabilities than the Soviet Union ever was. And so that is an important difference from the kind of asymmetric bipolarity that existed in the Cold War era. There is another difference that I think is going to be extremely consequential and which we have not yet fully come to terms with. And that is the new bipolarity is going to be embedded in a world of substantial economic integration. And I know the Trump administration has made a remarkable effort at trying to break down those structures of integration. But I'm not persuaded that that effort will succeed. It may succeed in some narrow areas, but the notion that we will be able to comprehensively decouple the United States from China economically, I think is a pipe dream. The idea that we will be able to break down what is essentially a globalized system of interdependence into and return to an older world of national autarkies, I think is simply beyond our capacity. And that means that the bipolarity of the future will take place in a world where, even though there are geopolitical antagonisms of significant magnitude, those geopolitical antagonisms will continually have to negotiate the reality of mutual dependence among the antagonists. For the United States, what that simply means are two things. First, it denies us the luxury of containing China in a way that we contained China, the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We will remain connected to China economically, even as we compete with it in the area of politics. The second consequence is that the United States will not enjoy the luxury of tight alliance solidarities as we had during the Cold War, because our allies will find it very difficult to balance their economic interests, which include integration with China, with the security interests of deepening the partnership with the United States. And so, short of actual war, and I hope we avoid actual war, our partners will be perpetually trapped between the US and China and will be struggling to manage those entanglements. And so the new world order that I see will be a pale facsimile of the old one. Yeah, the facsimile will be relevant to the degree that there will be a return to asymmetrical bipolarity, but the conditions under which that asymmetrical bipolarity will manifest itself will, I think, be very different. So what about the third alternative, global conflict? I fear that the coming global system will remain conflictual, but with a bit of luck, hopefully without descending into war. In other words, the United States and China will continue to compete with respect to maximizing their own national powers and the national power of their respective alliances. And the alliances, of course, mean something very specific for the United States. We have partners in Europe, we have partners in Asia, and we have friends worldwide. For China, there are no obvious alliances, but there is clearly a rise of preponderant Chinese influence in key parts of Asia, and increasingly will be manifested in the Belt and Road system that China intends to construct as a de facto coalition in opposition to the United States and its partners. And so all the states involved, both the great powers and their friends and allies, will continually be trapped in a conflictual relationship, which is not going to go away. And so there will be a two-level game where conflict is concerned. The conflictual relationship at the level of geopolitics will be very apparent. And we're already beginning to see the fault lines, both in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. But there is another competition that is also taking place behind the scenes, and it's not an easy competition to sort of make sense of. And that is the perpetual struggle over the next decade for national economies trying to maximize their efficiency while limiting their vulnerability. And this competition, I don't think we have seen the end of. And it's a competition that is going to pull all countries in two opposing directions. The struggle to maximize efficiency is going to take us in the direction of interdependence, because we all know trade is critical to maximize national efficiency, to maximize national power. But on the other hand, trade is going to bring in its trail vulnerabilities. And so countries are going to struggle to limit their vulnerability to the trading system, even as they seek to exploit that trading system to expand their power. And there's no easy resolution to this form of competition. So you're going to see the intersections of two kinds of global conflicts: a geopolitical conflict that will be apparent and clear to the eye, and an economic conflict, which is going to be the perpetual tussle between growing interdependence and pressures for autarky. So what is the implication of all of this? The first implication for the United States, and this is something for us, which is hard for us to digest, is that the balancing of China will be imperative. The balancing of China will be essential in order to protect our own interests and the interests of our friends. But the clean balancing of China is going to remain elusive. And even more importantly, the clean balancing of China is going to be permanently elusive unless the Chinese cross the threshold of actually initiating war, in which case a lot of things will become clearer. I suspect, though, that as you pointed out, Ambassador Mansingh, the Chinese want to win without fighting. And if they manage to sustain that strategy successfully, then they will have confronted us with a really complicated conundrum of how you balance China without the clarity of balancing that we enjoyed in the previous Cold War world. So the first consequence is, although balancing is imperative, it will prove elusive, and clean versions of balancing may remain perpetually beyond reach. The second consequence to me, which is significant, is that interdependence will allow both our allies and the bystanders in the international system to play the United States off against China and vice versa. Because the dilemmas of managing the quest for power and the quest for prosperity simultaneously is going to create a lot of alternatives for countries that are in the middle to pursue strategies that will not be entirely to the satisfaction of each of the two great powers. And in that sense, there will be space for countries to play the game if they are willing to play the game smartly. And this creates real opportunities for India itself. Let me use this as really a point to transition to the issues that are specifically focused on India. First, whether India likes it or not, it has to come to terms with one fundamental change in its strategic environment. And that fundamental change is that for the first time in many millennia, India faces the reality of having a genuine superpower on its doorsteps. This has not been true for the longest periods of Indian history. And India's strategy throughout the Cold War was to try and avert exactly this outcome. Now, this outcome has finally occurred. China is present and China is not going away. So the question really for me is, how does India respond to these capabilities? The truth is, India has enormous potential, but as of today, it is still unrealized potential. And it will be a long time before India can satisfactorily realize that potential in order to be able to balance China independently on its own. That is the Indian ambition. I mean, it's clear, and we have no difficulties with it. I mean, the United States has no problems with an India that seeks to balance China independently. If India can pull that off, all power to India. What I think Americans fear is that India lacks the capacity to balance China independently in the near term, while still remaining reluctant to balance China by building external affiliations, at least in the interim. And this is really where the whole question about Indian diffidence and India's unwillingness to consider possibilities beyond going it alone become troublesome. Now, let me be a little more specific here. I have no doubt that India is balancing China. But India has gone to great lengths over the last 2 decades to pretend that it's not balancing China. Unfortunately, I don't think that has fooled anyone in Beijing. And so India now has to face up to the reality that the strategy of balancing China through dissembling is a strategy that certainly has not persuaded the Chinese. But the very emphasis on dissembling is actually preventing India from realizing the benefits from more open affiliations with others. And whether those more open affiliations have to be an affiliation with the United States, an affiliation with the Quad countries, an affiliation with other Asian partners, that's for India to choose. But it seems to me that unless India acquires a little more intellectual clarity about how it wants to manage its international partnerships, it runs the risk of falling between two stools. That it's not strong enough to cope with rising Chinese power independently, and it's not resolute enough to be able to move smartly in the direction of accepting some privileged relationships with others that actually give it the possibilities. So I'm going to answer your 4 questions very quickly, Ambassador Mansingh, and we can come back to them if I don't do justice. On Jaishankar's key point that the world is going to be characterized by multipolarity, I'm not entirely persuaded by it at all. I'm open to being convinced. I've just begun to read Jai's book, and I hope I change my mind at the end of the process. But from where I stand now, I think multipolarity is a will of the wisp. It's on a distant horizon. But I agree with the conclusion that multilateralism is going to be weakened considerably. It's going to be weakened considerably because the logic of multilateralism either requires a hegemonic power that is willing to bear the costs of multilateralism, which seems to me to be questionable given where the United States is going, or multilateralism requires a strong convergence of common interests. And I don't see those common interests being manifest in a world of asymmetrical bipolarity. So the reality of having frenemies, unfortunately, I fear, is going to be a permanent operating condition for us. 2, the issue of US rejuvenation. Never count the United States out. It's a mistake to bet against the long-term future of the United States. And my own view is that even the China problem for the United States is really a China problem only for the next 20 to 30 years. Because after we cross the hump of the next 20 to 30 years, China's weaknesses are going to become much more apparent than its rising strengths. 3rd, US-China conflict. I agree with Bob in this completely. The competition is going to be a permanent feature of the international landscape going forward. war is a possibility, though I hope fervently that we can avoid war. Not because of simply the implications of war for national security and commerce and all the rest, but because a real Sino-US war would cleave the international system in ways that we are not prepared for. And it would lead to a hardening of that bipolarity, which potentially can destroy interdependence itself. Last point on US-India relations. I'm broadly optimistic about US-India relations because if you believe my theory that asymmetric bipolarity is going to define the core of the international system, then the opportunities for the United States and India are still going to be immense. And I share your optimism that it really doesn't matter whether there are Democrats or Republicans in the White House post January 2021, because it's not going to change the reality of the need that the US and India will have for each other. It will not be an alliance. And I agree with Dr. Jaishankar on this completely. It's not simply that India doesn't want an alliance. I'm not sure the US wants an alliance either, because an alliance means binding obligations. And I'm not sure we are in the appetite for more binding obligations, even towards India. So the question is not an alliance. The question is what kind of partnership and what price each is willing to make that partnership real in order to deal with the challenge that we are both going to face in common, which is China, a China that's not going away. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. You've given us a lot of profound thoughts to chew on. I now call upon Ambassador Chinoy to make his presentation. Sujan.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the invitation to speak today. And it's a real pleasure to join you and General Lamba and my friend Ashley Tellis. It's very tempting to want to say something on what the previous speakers have just said, but I'd rather stick to my narrow brief that's been given to me in the next 15 minutes. And I shall do so by first looking at the broadest contours of the international and regional situation, and then swiftly try and move over to the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And in doing so, I may also make a few points which may contradict what Ashley might have said, but that will not be with any kind of malice or rancor towards you. You know, it's a fact today that China's unilateralism and aggression is evident all the way from the East China Sea to the high Himalayas in Ladakh. And this has really intensified contestation throughout the region. China is upping the ante from our point of view in South Asia, using its political heft, its economic heft, and its military might as well to shape outcomes in our part of the world. In the Indian Ocean, we have seen China come in for the first time after 600 years, because the last time they were really here in any kind of, albeit episodic fashion, was in the Ming dynasty in the 15th century. And overall, a putative dyad comprising the United States and China seems to be very much dominating the global discourse and is likely to do so, as Ashley has also suggested, but this will not be without challenge. And the challenge will come from the equalization that is afforded even to asymmetrical powers. If this were not the case, you would not have seen the Potemkin spectacle of the President of the United States engaging with such zeal and enthusiasm the leadership of North Korea. So that's just a point in a fractured world that is likely to remain a fact that we will all live with for the foreseeable future. In the Indo-Pacific, a fundamental fact that strikes me is that for the last 2 decades at least, an ambitious China is virtually seeking the expulsion of the United States of America and other great powers from its immediate periphery, and especially to limit the extent of their power and sway on issues that have a bearing on China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, period. Now, this is a great irony, because in my view, the United States and the other great powers, including France and Great Britain in particular, have had a long-standing presence in the Indo-Pacific in terms of their territories and nationals economic interests. And above all, I see the United States having played a fundamentally important role as a factor for stabilization and economic prosperity over the last 70 years after the end of the Second World War. Even so, we can say frankly, and this I say without hesitation, that the US pivot to Asia, which was spoken about in the second term of President Obama, was completely ineffective. It did nothing really to restore the balance in Asia, and the 9/11 terror attacks and the diversion of US interests to other geographies was something that left behind a huge vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, and unsurprisingly, China stepped in with great alacrity. It has done so in the South China Sea, but more effectively, it has also done so through structures that are aimed at making things inclusive, such as the Belt and Road, which of course India opposes, but also the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, of which India is a founding member. And I believe that the Indo-Pacific is largely a belated recognition of the natural trend that is seen in our region as economic growth and prosperity, which was first seen in Japan, later spread to the Asian tigers, later spread to China, it then spread to Southeast Asia. It has definitely moved further westwards towards South Asia, and one might say all the way to the east coast of Africa. And therefore, I think the concept of the Asia-Pacific is a thing of the past. It has outlived its utility, and Indo-Pacific is a concept of the future. It is in this broad context that I want to actually point out some of the limitations of the Quad, because we've heard, generally speaking, a great deal about the advantages of a Quad. So I thought I'd be the devil's advocate today and leave it for you and listeners to decide as to what exactly would be its future. Its genesis lies in a response developed by like-minded countries in the aftermath of the Great Tsunami of 2004. And the strategic community in China, nevertheless, has branded it right from the word go as a potential emerging Asian NATO that is set to target and contain China. But you can see for yourselves that the Quad had dissipated rather quickly after the first round, thanks to my old friend, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He and I served together for many years in China as well. And he walked away on account of Chinese sensibilities. But some might also say that the United States then was not very keen on a revival looking to its own interests in working together with Russia and perhaps others at that point of time, North Korea included. Now, more recently, the Quad has picked up momentum, as you know, in 2017 with dialogue at the ministerial level. But it has a few limitations. And the first of this is that, for instance, there is talk of inviting Australia to the Malabar exercise. But this may have to wait, as the chair rightly pointed out, right at the outset, to see how US policy towards the region shapes up after the November election, the succession to Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and also to wait until the dust has settled on the current dust up in the high Himalayas between India and China. Now, tensions between India and China have also thrown into sharper salience a particular fact that if push comes to shove in Ladakh, for instance, India stands alone, really. We have to deal with this aggression on our own. There may be some moral support coming from the United States and other members of the Quad. We may even have good intelligence sharing and cooperation, particularly with the United States of America. But there is not much else that they can do to actually bail us out. Both Japan and Australia have their limitations. And despite their recent awakening, particularly in Australia, to the perils of overdependence on China for their economic prosperity, they really cannot play a role in the land boundary threats that India faces. The focus of the Quad then is primarily maritime in nature. Look, 3 of the 4 countries basically have an exclusive maritime focus, and that too primarily in the South China Sea and the waters beyond, barring the exception of the United States, which has a much broader interest, including in the Indian Ocean. And the other three, other than India, also have a primary focus that does not extend to the land borders of India, particularly with China and Pakistan. So it's India alone that has a duality of threats and challenges to deal with. The other issue is about how hyperpowers behave, and maybe Ashley will not agree with me on this, but hyperpowers tend to believe in the notion of exceptionalism, the principle of exceptionalism. And the US conducts, for instance, FONOPs against friend and foe alike. It fails to make a distinction at the best of times. The list of countries against which it conducts FONOPs includes India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. FONOPs are essentially an optical symbol of US naval potency. They deny China the satisfaction of a complete takeover of the oceanic space through fictitious claims, artificial islands, etc., the spurious baselines and the unilateral air defense identification zone, but they do nothing, absolutely nothing, to restore status quo ante. So therefore, in my view, it's a tactical characteristic of US presence there to conduct FONOPs. The strategic aspect is what exactly can be done to restore status quo ante, and I don't see much happening in the South China Sea. Now, it's small consolation, of course, that recently the United States, at the level of Secretary Pompeo, has very publicly declared that after a gap of 4 years, the US position on the South China Sea is now in full alignment with the tribunal award. Till now, it was looking at the facts. It had said it would not go into the merits of the case. And I'm glad to see that there is greater alignment, but it still does nothing to restore status quo ante, including on, Macclesfield and Mischief Reef and all these places that were taken in the past by the Chinese through military action. As a great power, I believe that the United States is capable of duality of engagement, with trade friction, human rights breaching, and deeper military engagement all being offered side by side. I mean, that's the bouquet, the smorgasbord that you would offer. And that comes from the US essentially continuing to be a hyperpower. But let's not forget that China too is increasingly seeking exceptionalism by rewriting the rules, by editing structures, current and prospective global mechanisms to accommodate its own economic and military power that's seen considerable accretion. But it focuses, unlike the United States, more on strategies to woo constituencies and to shape outcomes. Its actions are completely bereft of moral underpinning. It should be little wonder then that even as the Quad seeks to engage a broader constituency through the Quad Plus format, there are a large number of countries across the Indo-Pacific, including smaller nations in South Asia, which find themselves increasingly drawn towards China's Belt and Road as would moths to a flame, and to China's developmental finance, despite the obvious risks in the longer term. And this is true when they evaluate, for instance, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and its initiatives. The other point is about ASEAN centrality, and this is fundamental to the future of the Quad as well. Now, all the Quad countries accept ASEAN centrality, but there is a fact there that ASEAN has a complete lack of consensus on China, and the code of conduct still remains the holy grail of the region. China has generally succeeded in its divide and rule policy towards ASEAN, and none of the Quad countries are involved in any of the negotiations as regards the draft code of conduct, which really, to my mind, suggests, given the overwhelming economic and in many cases dependence for security that the ASEAN countries increasingly have with China, it suggests that China really will have much greater opportunity to determine the outcome of any code of conduct that they come up with in the future. I believe that the free and open Indo-Pacific vision still remains very ideational, although it increasingly figures in everybody's white papers and vision documents, strategic discourse involving a large number of stakeholders. The Quad is a forum of like-minded countries for building consensus and coordination on specific issues. And it's really not, as Wang Yi has put it earlier, the foreign minister of China, that it is just an attention-grabbing idea and it would soon dissipate like ocean foam. If anything, it is gradually acquiring form and substance. But as to what direction it will take, it really depends on the geostrategic contestation that is still unraveling and unfolding in our part of the world. And again, ironically, much more than the Quad members, it will be China and its behavior that will actually determine the future of the Quad. But the other point I want to make is about the reference to democracies. I think it's a mistake. To call it a coalition of democracies at the moment is a mere statement of fact. The 4 countries involved are democracies. But it is a self-limiting proposition if the Quad intends to grow into something bigger and to build an exoskeleton that includes many more participants in the future. For that is what it will take to fend off the rise of China. After all nations in the Indo-Pacific follow very eclectic systems of governance, and not all fit the standard dictionary definition of a democracy. So in referring to the creation of a free, open, and inclusive regional architecture, rules of the road and freedom of navigation and oversight, recently it appears that countries of the Quad have actually decided to drop reference to the word democracy from their pronouncements and press releases. And this actually helps to allow the Quad to engage in that broader dialogue that it's seeking in a Quad Plus format. Finally, I want to say that the Quad is not a factor, as I've said before, in the current tensions on the India-China border. In a land dispute, we really cannot expect other members of the Quad to pull our chestnuts out of the fire. And there does not exist in my view again, and sorry, Ashley, if I were to counter something that you just said, in my view, there does not exist a fixed model for alignment with the United States or with any other Quad power. Alliances can be restrictive. My view is that the US itself has a broad array of different types of treaties and alliances, very flexible mechanisms at that, from the fullest to the smallest lily pads. The fullest potential, in my view, of the India-US strategic relationship should be anchored in the flexibility of options available to both sides. Without a formal alliance agreement, the sum, the addition of what both India and the US can do in tandem will be much greater than what they could possibly do through a formal alliance. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you the example of both Japan and Australia. Their own independent response over the years to Chinese provocations and aggression has never been what it ought to have been. And I'm sure you'll agree with that part of my assertion here, partly because of inbuilt complacency provided by formal alliance structure, partly due to the subordination of sovereign red lines to the thresholds of an alliance partner. An alliance demands a common denominator, and that has a direct impact. One direct impact is to lower your sovereign thresholds into a common denominator that is also acceptable to possibly a distant alliance partner. And lastly, also because of profound interdependence on China of the type that you said isn't going to go away. I agree there. Decoupling on trade is virtually impossible, but we do see the world rapidly descending into 2 camps, a Cold War evolving around the technology space. Finally, the US has been, frankly, supportive of India's position in the ongoing border tensions with China in Ladakh. Japan and Australia continue to, by the way, depict Aksai Chin as an integral part of China without indicating its disputed status, unlike the US depiction of Aksai Chin as a disputed territory. So there, I think, among the other 3 in the Quad, I give more marks to the United States, a little less to both Japan and Australia. And I, by the way, wrote a paper on this as well. It was very unconventional to point this out. It's somewhat embarrassing, but between friends, you must speak the truth. Now, lastly, considering that the United States, Japan, and Australia have a growing convergence with India, and that we wish to do much more together, particularly in the context of the Quad, I think it's an appropriate moment for the United States, Japan, and Australia to engage in a bit of action to address their legacy cartographic anomalies in their maps, their official maps that can be seen on their websites. And personally, I feel this would also go as much to strengthen the Quad as would the logistics sharing pacts that we have signed with the United States, then with Australia, and yesterday with Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sujan.
Ambassador,
Thank you for the remarks.
Ambassador Mansingh.
Now we have, sorry, is somebody wanting to say?
Vivekanand here. I just wanted to ask all participants if they have any questions to use the chat box to send in the questions. So while the panelists discuss with each other, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and Ambassador Mansingh will later have a look at the questions. That was all. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Vivekanand. We have now time for the panelists to have discussions among themselves. And let me throw in this suggestion. Sujan, you said that you had some differences with what Ashley has said about the future geopolitics. And maybe this is the time for you to tell us where you specifically differ from what he said. Secondly, Ashley, I think you could respond to Sujan's suggestion that the solution doesn't lie in fixed partnerships or alliances, but in flexible arrangements. And so the idea that India must face stark choices, it seems to me that that is not necessary. We can have flexible alliances. And this is, I think, what Jaishankar was talking about when he talked about multiple alliances which are transactional, but not necessarily exclusive. So let's start off on these issues, and General Lamba could join in with his issues, if any. So the floor is open to all three of you.
I request the chair.
Go ahead.
All right.
I'm sorry.
No,
okay,
go ahead.
whenever,
Sir.
Sujan, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'll be very brief. Can you hear me, Chair?
I can come in with those two questions.
Yes, could I request the fellow panelists to briefly voluntarily mute their mics so that I don't get echoes? And of course, you can then unmute yourself. Thank you, sir. No, I don't want to repeat myself, but there were just 2 points where I really had a slightly different view from Ashley's. One was that in the emerging world where we are likely to see, and I fully agree with him that the United States must never be underestimated. It is likely to remain the major power through the 21st century, and that there is much, between the cup and the lip that could actually slip as far as China is concerned in years to come. But that's for another session. The key point I wanted to make was that there is in this fractured world an ability for states, small states, and non-state actors that enjoy certain types of power, what you might call results in complete asymmetry between them and the two major powers, to also exercise unconventional ways to equalize. So there is a certain asymmetrical spectrum of options available for bridging that gap today. And I gave the example of how a superpower like the United States would have to sit down and quietly discuss things and humor North Korea as well. But that's just an example. So that's the world of the future. It is not necessarily going to be in very black and white terms as to United States and then a distant second China enjoying absolute power. There will be scope for bridging that asymmetry on the part of all. The second point, of course, I did belabor that point a bit, that it is not necessary to have alliance as a condition for deepening our cooperation. There, my simple arithmetic was that the 2 + 2 that is provided by a formal alliance is actually not necessarily 4. And if it is 4, then what we can do together without a formal alliance is actually 2 + 2 = 5, because it's not a self-limiting concept. There is no common denominator. Japan doesn't have to watch what the red line for the United States is as far as Chinese incursions into the Senkakus are. Whether it's going to be a tripwire for the US, it'll only judge it for the tripwire that it provides to Japan. And this is the way we are looking at our current situation in Ladakh as far as the LAC is concerned, where from a territorial dispute over a much vaster territory in the 1950s and early 60s, we are now having contestation in the context of the line of actual control. So we've moved from territory to a kind of borderline boundary dispute in that strict sense of a line. Thank you.
Ashley, any comments?
Well, let me respond to 2 issues. First, I want to tell Sujan that I'm going to disappoint him because I actually agree with almost everything he said. But let me come back to 2 issues which I think are important. I have no difficulty, and I said that in my oral remarks, that because of the character of the evolution of the system, there will be place for small powers to play both the great powers against each other and create niches where they can enjoy autonomy. But I don't think one should exaggerate the capacity of small power autonomy to have sort of system-wide effects. Now, weapons of mass destruction are a very special case, which is why the US traditionally has always been obsessed with non-proliferation, because we know it asymmetrically endows small states with terrific advantages. And so North Korea is a special case on that particular issue. But if you keep WMD sort of off the table, the ability of small powers to enhance autonomy to the point where they can take on great power interests, to my mind, is questionable. But I think this is really a debate about sort of marginal issues. It's not central. The second point has to do with alliances. The US-India alliance in particular, right? I am of the view that the alliance question is actually a red herring, because it's not simply a question of whether India wants the alliance. There's also the question of whether the US wants the alliance. And one simply should not presume that the US wants an alliance if having an alliance means a commitment to collective defense. Because collective defense involves significant obligations on the part of the United States. And I'm not sure that the US wants that. So the issue is not whether we have an alliance or not. The issue is whether we can build up stable, predictable, and deep levels of cooperation, even without an alliance system. And this is where I must complain, and I complain only because I'm among friends, that India's willingness to engage in this deep and predictable cooperation, I think, is still hampered by considerable reticence. For me, if we can make improvements at this level of practical cooperation between the militaries, between our diplomats, between our cooperation and coordination international organizations, I think that would have payoffs far beyond any debates about alliances. So I think we should sort of agree among ourselves and sort of collectively and beyond even those in this room to sort of set the alliance question aside and now look at more practical things that we can do in the absence of the alliance that changes outcomes, right? Changes the outcomes that we seek. One small quibble on this: don't presume that the US can do little to nothing to aid India even in its continental confrontations. I mean, there is a lot of material power that the US can bring to bear. The question is whether India wants it. And my suspicion is that India does not want it and will not want it unless things really reach a supreme emergency. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, we don't need to push ourselves in situations where we might make things worse. But I think there is a lot more that the US can do but it is Indian reticence, sometimes for very good reasons, that gets in the way.
Could I, with Chair's approval, just briefly respond to what you said? Look,
Yes,
I agree, Ashley, with all that you've said. And frankly, you have the example of a reluctant Nehru, who laid such great store by non-alignment, which then was his version of strategic autonomy of the type that we speak of today, in a different iteration. And yet, when we had the hostilities in 1962, Nehru himself was compelled to write to President Kennedy and to request for substantive military aid and assistance, including aircraft, munitions, etc., manpower as well, to man some of these things. Well, the help did come in. It was a little too late, but the larger principle was in evidence that the United States was seeking to help India. Thereafter, we did see a little bit of what we read about today in terms of history, the covert, cooperation. You had the, U-2 spy plane flights out of Orissa. You also had in 1965 the, the so-called, sort of atomic device, listening device on, Nanda Devi in the Garhwal Himalayas in Uttarakhand. So, I mean, there has been a certain, cooperation that we have seen, and I do agree with you that there is a great deal that the United States can do, and how much. But there is, when it comes to military equipment, I must bait you a little bit with this to suggest that you've never been so ready in terms of transfer of technology. And I do hope the industrial security annex that we concluded last year during Mr. Rajnath Singh's visit, which is an annex to the GSOMIA of 2002, will actually pave the way for a closer sort of collaboration between industry participants on both sides in defense manufacturing and transfer of technology.
Well, there are two quick points, Ashley, if I may. I'm getting the sense that in your emerging worldview, there will be two superpowers, and that's what we have to lump, whether we like it or not. It's raising the nightmares of the so-called G2 that has been coming up from time to time. And your remarks somehow reinforce that feeling that hereafter there are these two big guys and we have to learn to live with them. One, am I correct in that? And secondly, when you say that the US is open to other countries, its friends and allies, developing closer relations with countries other than the United States, I hope that we will see a little less of the hypersensitivity that the US has shown in recent times, that we can't deal with the Iranians or we can't deal with the Russians, even though we need Russian equipment for our borders. And we have gone ahead and done that. But we have raised a lot of anger in Washington because of that. Now, the US must also understand our compulsions and let us pursue our national interests if it's not in conflict with the United States. So maybe some quick answers, and then I'll ask General Lamba if he has any points to make.
So a quick response to I agree with the principle completely, that the US needs to be a lot more liberal in terms of our capacity to appreciate that India will have independent relations with other countries. But frankly, our approach to Iran today is irrational, and India has unfortunately become a victim of that irrationality. On Russia, I think there has actually been a growing appreciation of India's relations with Russia. Even this administration, which has a very strange, almost schizophrenic approach to Russia, has recognized the notion that India's relationship with Russia, especially in the military realm, will not change. And if you look carefully, for example, in the last year, there has not been a sound made about CAATSA sanctions and so on and so forth, for the very reason that I think that recognition has sort of set in. On the question of the G2, I think that is virtually impossible. The idea of the G2 had a very short shelf life in the first months of the Obama first term. because the US still hewed to the illusion then that economic ties between the US and China's willingness to support the larger global order sort of brought us together. I think today, the discrepancies both on the power front and on the value front has become so pronounced that the notion that the US could consider a partnership with China as opposed, sort of set up against the rest of the international system, I think that is simply implausible. So it's not something you should worry about. But I do want to make one point though, because people tend to overlook this fact. There will be a G2 as a practical matter, which is simply where capabilities are concerned. And I don't think any amount of arm waving is going to change that fact. Where comprehensive national power is concerned, the US and China are going to be in a league by themselves. It's simply a reality. There's nothing that is going to change that for at least the next 2 decades.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. General Lamba, would you have any comments? I realize we are also running way behind time. So we will have to wind up this discussion and give time to questions and answers. So please go ahead with your comments.
Thank you, Chair. I think that was a very important question that was raised and a point that was analyzed in detail. I am of the view that today's strategic alliances and strategic partnerships stand almost almost co-laced with one another. When national interests coming from 1, 2, 3 nuclear deal till today, from a military and a security perspective, if I go back, I recall the days on the 10th of December, 1971, when we were to be Bangladesh during the war. It was the American 7th Fleet and the Russian submarines that were actually doing the balance of power. And it was the politics and geopolitics of that time that were different. But today, carrying that forward is a huge positive stroke. And I think India evolving from decades of non-alignment into strategic autonomy, and now in the realms of engagement, it has the kind of strategic partnerships it has evolved, perhaps must be in content the best in the world anywhere, maybe with Japan, with the United States, with Vietnam, and with many other countries. So I think with United States, if Taiwan can get the benefit of United States right into the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait as directly as 3 aircraft carriers at one time, I think the unsaid is possible without a strategic alliance. They also have a simple strategic partnership and giving of military equipment. So I'm of the view that this is a stage of evolution. India and US, in my view, would be a force of good. And the change in perspectives is not evolved. I think it's been adapted. They've been architectured and they've been put together in a manner that they benefit not only both the countries, but the region and the world in terms of stability and the larger good. And I think I am one who would feel from a military perspective that the kind of engagement, technology provided to the military, and the articulation and content of so many agreements, SESMOA, LEMOA, BECA, I can count a huge number of them, pretty consequent to L22+2 meetings. We are on a different fold. We might be somewhere between when the time is opportune, there would be a far more contribution, no matter what the name of this engagement is. And I personally think this is a lot move forward. Chair, if you allow me, there was one question that you had posed to me. I can take a minute to do that about sure. Admiral Sushil Mehta's comment. There were actually 2 questions, and one it said that with such a large force capability, how does India really balance out its capability? The China has the world's largest navy, the air force, in numbers, the PLA. We've come to a asymmetric rebalancing where India can posture its strengths in terms of its levels at the right time, on the right spot, in the right numbers. Second, the terrain can be taken advantage of Third, the foreign policy, which was not so clear before 2015 or so, is far more clear and has formidable outcomes. And I think it's ultimately the political will into the foreign policy, into a security strategy, and the combat capability or the combat power. In this event, in this cycle of events and evolution, I think we are in a position where India has not recently, last week, made a stake that there is a military option if other options do not work, speaks for itself where the equations really lie. Such a statement from this office can only be based on foundation that's concrete, evaluated, and possibly dominant enough to carry forward such a policy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, General Lamba. And this brings to a close the discussions amongst the panelists. Vivekananda, if we have a few more minutes for questions and answer. I noticed that we don't have too many questions put on the board, but let me address some of them. One is from...
I think Ambassador Chinoy would like to say. So since we don't have so many questions, maybe you can stay with the panel discussion a little longer.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. I just want to make two very brief military points. I actually agree with all that General Lamba has said. But look, as far as asymmetry on any border is concerned, such symmetry or asymmetry must not necessarily be seen in absolute military power. Because wars by their very nature in the foreseeable future are not likely to be wars of attrition, and they would be relatively short, quick, painful events. Now, when you look at the India-Pakistan equation, roughly the same kind of asymmetry prevails there. In terms of geography, it's even larger. In terms of the economic, imbalance, the kind of asymmetry that exists between India and China is also to be seen between India and Pakistan. And yet you all know, as experts, that a certain kind of a semblance of symmetry has built up over time on a particular border because two countries bring in a certain level of forces. So we must keep that in mind in judging the India-China asymmetry as well. The second brief military point is that, look, it's very important. General Lamba mentioned the American posture, including in the Taiwan Strait. But I might remind you that in 1995-96, under President Clinton, 2 carrier battle groups were asked to sail through the Taiwan Strait. And it actually put the Chinese on notice in terms of their, missile tests, etc. But are you also aware that the last time that the Americans sent a carrier battle group through Taiwan Strait was in 2007? 13 years have passed since a carrier battle group last sailed through the Taiwan Strait. It was the USS Kitty Hawk that was actually on a mission to Hong Kong for the usual R&R and berthing, porting, etc. And the Chinese had bluntly, out of pique at deteriorating ties or whatever, told the Americans that you cannot berth here. And the Americans had asked it to steam through the Taiwan Strait. Now, recently, a few weeks ago, we had a vessel again steam through, but these are individual ships. So I see, in my view, a particular change in the American resolve to demonstrate the presence of carrier battle groups in the Taiwan Strait that has commensurately reduced over the years. I might be wrong, and maybe Ashley can tell us more. Thank you.
Okay, Ashley, quick word, then we'll wind this.
Well, I think there is definitely increased caution about sending a carrier battle group, because if I was an operational sort of commander, the last place I would want a carrier battle group is actually in the Straits, because it's just far too narrow for the kind of space that a carrier battle group needs to operate effectively and survivably. So as a diplomatic signal, I think we ought to do it more often than we've done. But in a wartime context, I don't think any American commander would think of putting a battle group in the Straits. I mean, we would defend from far further east. And of course, there are all sorts of issues related with that, which can be discussed elsewhere.
Thank you. I think that time has now come to address some of the questions. And let me go to the first is less of a question. Well, it is a question, but let me summarize this. Gentleman called Oinam Thujal has sent a question. The allies of the United States have to contribute a certain percentage of the GDP at the price of the alliance. Now, he has cited the case of the NATO countries and Japan and South Korea, but I am not going to spend much time on that because this is a theoretical question. We are not military allies of the United States, and therefore estimating how much India has to pay is purely theoretical, and I suppose we don't need to discuss this. The second question is from Sanjay Pandey from JNU, and he asked the question, where do you see Russia in the future world order? Ashley, would you like to take this on to be supplemented by Sujan?
I mean, Russia is a very interesting question because its future trajectory is not sort of set in stone. But let me say two things there. One, Russian national power is been decreasing at an alarming rate since 1991. And if you look at the size of the Russian economy, if you look at the size of human capital indicators in Russia, they are sources of very profound despair. Russia still plays because it's a nuclear power. It still has, enormous potential assets. But where Russia chooses to go is still an open question. I think for the foreseeable future, the sort of de facto convergence with China will persist only because Russia has bigger grievances with the West and the United States in particular. And as long as those grievances remain pronounced, I don't think we can count Russia as part of, an anti-China coalition. To Trump's credit, he certainly tried, but he went about it in such a ham-handed way that he actually managed to make a renewal of US-Russians relations with Russia, not simply a foreign policy problem, but actually a domestic policy problem in the US. So I'm not optimistic about being able to peel Russia away from China, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. The next question is from Vinod Kumar. In fact, there are two questions. Is there any space for diplomacy to diffuse the situation along the border? And views on India not participating in Kafka's 2020. I'm afraid I don't know what that implies. So in this particular order, Sujan, Ashley, and General Lamba. Go ahead, please.
Mike.
No, it's on.
Yes, thank you. No, as far as Russia is concerned, I think we need to be very clear. Russia's a Pacific power. It's always been one. And it's also a Eurasian power. Russia's had a long-standing presence in the Indo-Pacific. And we must not negate that fact. I might remind you that very recently, just a few days ago, we carried out the Indra exercise, naval exercise between India and Russia in the Bay of Bengal. Now, look at it this way. A fairly diminished Russia is drawing very close under pressure to China. And it'll be a lamentable footnote in history that in or around January 2017, the United States was looking to a reset in relations with Russia. And thereafter it descended into a complete, sort of deterioration and mutual suspicions. But one of the ways that the Americans could actually balance China is to maintain a slightly more flexible, sort of posture vis-a-vis Russia. I know that might be difficult. It's for, the Americans to judge. But if you don't do that, the Russians are being pushed into a corner. When it comes to, for instance, the South China Sea, they're exercising with the Chinese. When it comes to the Western Indian Ocean, they've exercised with China and Iran. They've also exercised with China and South Africa. Of course, India, South Africa, and Brazil also carry out some exercises. But if Russia needs to come into the Indian Ocean, I would suggest it must have India as the first docking point and not China, not necessarily a tandem with Iran. And the Americans can play a helpful role by easing the foot off the pedal of pressure on Russia when your primary purpose should be to defang China.
Thank you. Ashley?
Two responses. I agree with Sujan's last remarks in principle, but I fear that as long as President Putin is in office, and as long as President Putin continues to nurse the grievances that he does with relate to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the US role in that collapse, the kind of latitude that one would like to see in principle with respect to US attitudes to Russia, those will be very hard to bring about. And the more Russia continues to meddle in US domestic politics, and we will see even more evidence of that in the next few weeks for the elections, it's simply going to harden Indian attitudes. So in this case, the strategic logic collides dramatically with domestic compulsions in both Russia and Washington to prevent the outcome from coming about. On the second question, which had to do with diplomacy in the India-China crisis, I think so far, India's emphasis has been entirely on diplomacy. It's barring the events that occurred on the 29th and 30th. India has attempted to walk back, or at least persuade the Chinese to walk back the aggression, really through diplomatic negotiations coupled with an effort to sort of penalize China economically. It has not engaged in a full-scale military response. And I think the Indian strategy in general is an extremely sound one. The only concern that I have is whether India has the leverage to punish China through economic means alone. And if that leverage is not existent, and I think there are big questions there, whether economic penalties will suffice to get the Chinese to restore the status quo ante remains an open question. I think India is not looking for a fight, but there is clearly a change in Indian strategy in the last few weeks. There is a willingness now to protect its equities, if necessary, through preemptive action, if necessary, by risking an armed confrontation. And to my mind, that is actually a very salutary development. Because if India does not show that it's willing to accept those risks, the Chinese will simply roll over India at every opportunity they get. So from my vantage point, the fact that India is now pursuing quid pro quo strategies is actually a welcome development.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I think a lot of discussion is going on amongst experts in India about the economic dimensions of the conflict and how India can weaponize the economic relationship and to what extent. General Lamba, would you like to add to anything that is said so far? General Lamba? No. Okay.
Chair, may I request you to repeat the question? There was a little disruption in the internet.
No, the question was what I had told earlier. The questioner wanted to know whether diplomacy has a role to play in the conflict. And I think the answer is obvious. And Ashley has addressed that to some extent. Would you like to add to that? Okay.
So
let's go
I have to just request you to repeat it once again, sir. There is once more, sir.
Never mind. Let's go to the next.
Could I just come in quickly on that?
Yeah, sure.
Chair, thank you very much. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that the answer is obvious. I think the military option of holding our positions there and fighting, if it comes to that, to protect what is our territory, and negotiations and diplomacy, both at the military and the diplomatic level, must proceed simultaneously. We have been through several phases in our ties with China when we've had to do both. And I think they must proceed alongside. This is not to suggest that there can be a sudden breakthrough, but engagement must always remain top of the list of options. The military option obviously must be lowered down, necessary to exercise that if it comes to that, but we would prefer obviously to resolve all differences through negotiations. That's the hope that we bear.
Okay, thank you, Sujan. Let me turn to the next question, which seems to be the last question. It's raised by Saurav Kumar, and it's an intriguing comment. He asks about the possibility of a US-led joint stand by all democratic countries to come to the rescue of Tibet. But he himself answers the question towards the end by saying that he realizes it's a tall order. And then asks, are there any easy answers to checking predatory states like the People's Republic of China? Now, that's a question which all of you can answer. So again, in the same order, General Lamba, Ashley, and Ambassador Sujan Chinoy. General Lamba.
So I feel this is firstly about the options that we had, the military option, the last one. When I could make out the question from Mr. Madhav's answer, that the military option would be the last one. The diplomacy cannot probably may not do it alone, but I think we are prepared for that option as a last recourse to this situation. And I think no military actually wants an engagement that would put countries back or the regions back economically. I think that was the first part, sir. And I'm again having a problem. The last question I will have to request you to repeat, sir. I would like to answer that.
We are running out of time, so let's sort of wind up because we are way outside our time limits. Let's address the last question. Can you hear me, General Lamba?
I can, sir.
Yeah. It's from Mr. Saurav Kumar, who asks about the possibility of a US-led initiative of democracies coming to the help of Tibet. And he himself admits it's a tall order, but he asks whether we have any advice on how countries can check predatory states like China. Do you have any advice on that?
Yes, sir, indeed. And I think that's a very positive stroke. I think democratic countries and institutions would all support that, knowing the history, how Tibet was virtually overwhelmed over a period of several years by China. It is imperative that the voices across the world stand up to this cause. And as we see ourselves, there are several forums, not only in India, but in Asia, that are steering up and our voice in this direction. It's the people of Tibet that have actually been led to a state of not being an entity.
Okay, you support the idea.
I do, sir. I do.
All right. Now, quick answers, Ashley.
Well, I think what has happened in Tibet has been simply tragic. And this goes back to 1951, starting with the campaign and ending up with where Tibet is now. But the realities with respect to Chinese sovereignty over Tibet are essentially congealed. And there is nothing that the United States or anyone else can do to roll back the events of the last 70 odd years. What we can do, though, is to shine the spotlight and make certain that Tibet's autonomy within the framework of Chinese sovereignty is essentially protected. The US has made a tremendous effort in the last few years to shine the spotlight on Xinjiang. And there is absolutely no reason why we cannot do similarly with respect to Tibet.
Thank you. Sujan?
A quick word on Tibet, a subject that's close to my heart. Now, firstly, please remember that President Trump has never met the Dalai Lama. He's not agreed to see the Dalai Lama at all during his term. And that's not the same as previous presidents. The second point is that the post of a special coordinator for Tibetan affairs in the State Department, which was set up in, way back in 2002, and had successive incumbents, was last vacated by the last incumbent in 2017. And it's President Trump's administration that has not appointed any replacement there. So I'm just wondering how the United States in its current format under the Trump presidency is going to take the lead on such matters. And if you flash back to history, the fact is that in 1942, the president of the United States had then written to the regent at that point of time, since His Holiness the Dalai Lama was a young boy, asking for access to Tibet for the war effort in order to build airports and roads, etc. And he had used the word then in his communication as suzerainty of China over Tibet. In 1948, when the Tibetans wanted to send a trade delegation to Washington, it did go. It was not received at the last minute by the President of the United States. And in internal communications, the Secretary of State used the term sovereignty of China. The covert operations, as you're aware, in the 50s lasted only until the rapprochement. So in other words, as Ashley just suggested, it seems that a great deal of water has, sort of flown by in the past 70 years. And the very unfortunate part is that today, there's not a single country that actually recognizes Tibet as an independent country. To its credit, the United States has come up with a recent Tibet policy. As you know, it's been passed in the Congress and yet to be passed in the Senate. And the one tool that they do have, which they are trying to exercise, whether it is Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or Tibet, is the force of sanctions. To sanction people according to this act that would interfere in the internal affairs, the ecclesiastical affairs of the succession to the Dalai Lama. And well done there, the United States of America.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that historical perspective. I'm very pleased that all three of you have strongly endorsed the idea that Tibet must be helped. And I think we need to do whatever is possible. There is a glimmer of hope, because I've seen in the Biden manifesto that he will meet the Dalai Lama. And I take it that he will restore the position of the special representative and continue the dialogue with the Tibetans and with His Holiness. We look forward to that. Now, we are coming to the end of the program because we have overshot our time limit. But I must say that this has been a very, very intense discussion, a very stimulating discussion, which is befitting the subject that we have discussed. I might add that in very few seminars or webinars that I have experience of, I have not come across such a high level of intellectual intensity as in the discussions today. And therefore, I thank the Sondhi Foundation. Thank you, Mrs. Sondhi. Thank you, Vivekananda, for giving us this platform. And from all of us, let me say a big thank you. And we look forward to continuing this kind of dialogue in the future. Vivekananda, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mansingh. I would like to inform the participants that we'll have a third iteration of this webinar series, and we'll delve deeper into analyzing the possible impact of the US presidential elections. Professor Sondhi used to say that the rest of the world should get to vote in the US presidential elections, but it has such an impact on all of the world. So not only US citizens, but rest of us should also get to vote. That may not happen, but we can still analyze the elections. So, and we'll send out an invitation in short order. So now it's my duty to thank all the panelists. Dr. Tellis, it's morning in US and you woke up and you participated with us. So thank you so much. And
Pleasure.
Ambassador Mansingh, you are the not only a participant, but you are also a guiding force for this seminar series. So I'm extremely thankful to you. General Lamba, you've been a regular participant in our program, so thanks again. Ambassador Chinoy, it was a pleasure having you on our webinar today, and I hope I will have your cooperation in the future also.
Thank you.
Lastly, in terms of people who made the call, I would like to thank Mr. Tarun Sagar, who's the technology person who's been helping all of us from in the background, and everyone in the of the participants on the Zoom call or the YouTube channel. I mean, it's evening time in India, and there are participants from other parts of the world. You could have been doing other things, and there is no shortage of webinars today. So thanks for participating in this one and making this program successful. So thank you so much, and goodbye. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to the chair as well. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you. Thank you
fellow
all.
panelists as well. Thank you, Ashley. General
Take care.
Lamba, thank
Take
you.
care, all of
Take care.
you. It was wonderful
Yes.
seeing you.
You too take
Bye-bye.
care, Ashley. You too
Great.
take care, Ashley.
Thank you.
Great. See you all soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.